It is November of 2025, and to wrap up projector review season, I am performing my yearly service of using my own money to buy every projector on Amazon under $100 to figure out if any of them are actually decent. Because after 5 years of making this video, most cheap projector Amazon listings are still filled with misleading pictures and outright lies. And they're still selling thousands of projectors every single month. So for this video, I've got 25 projectors ranging from $25 to $99, and I'm gonna test their actual brightness and contrast. Then I will put them side by side to figure out which ones have the best overall image quality. And after that, I will pull out the top 5 to do some more in-depth testing of focus, input lag, throw distance, fan noise, speaker quality, and smart operating system features before making my final recommendations. And as always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel. Starting with brightness testing, I use the ANSI standard for measuring, where you take 9 individual brightness readings, average them together, and then multiply by the screen size in square meters to determine the ANSI lumens. And in this group, the brightest projector was the $99 Fidoni GC888A at 274 ANSI lumens. But if you consider the price, the $26 Umbelite HY320 Mini comes out way ahead with 171 tested ANSI lumens, which is 6.45 lumens per dollar compared to 2.74 lumens per dollar on the Fidoni. And while I'm at it, just to do a little bit of public shaming, here are the advertised lumens from each projector's Amazon listing compared to their actual lumens, where none of the projectors were able to match their advertised brightness, and only 7 of the 25 projectors had 50% or more of advertised, which makes me kind of appreciate the 6 projectors that didn't even bother to list their brightness on their Amazon page. I also measured their brightness uniformity, which is where you divide the dimmest of the 9 ANSI measurements by the brightest one, and the $76 Haprun H1 came out on top at 69%, but the Fidoni and Umbelite that I mentioned before also performed well with 65 and 62% uniformity. I also measured their contrast by comparing the center point brightness of a full white screen with the center point brightness of a full black screen with a 50% moving gray box. And the highest contrast came from the $54 Takaki at 2,767 to 1, but the Fidoni showed up in second place at 2,183 to 1, and the $26 Umbelite was still hanging in there in 5th place. Moving on to the side-by-side testing, I set up 2 100-inch white screens in my light-controlled garage, and I put the projectors head-to-head from the least expensive to the most, which made round 1 the $25 AntMap on the left and the $26 Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right. And the AntMap's 50 lumens were completely insufficient for it to compete with the Umbelite's 171 lumens, not to mention the AntMap's motion was bad, the aspect ratio was wrong, and the shadows were completely crushed, so the Umbelite moved on. Round 2 brings in the Beezus Q5 Mate on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right, and at 41 lumens the Beezus is even dimmer than the AntMap from last round, but it still looked slightly better since it isn't crushing shadows as badly, but it still didn't stand a chance against the Umbelite. So in round 3, the XBJ R8 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right. And the XBJ was brighter than the previous 2 challengers, but it was also too yellow and overall just extremely blurry compared to the Umbelite, which is still over twice as bright, making this another easy win for the Umbelite. In round 4, the SumFun SK1 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right. And finally, the Umbelite has some real competition, and the SumFun looks pretty decent. But compared to the Umbelite, it just isn't as sharp, it's got noticeable light pollution in dark areas, and it also crushes shadow detail while having a higher black floor. So the Umbelite moves on again. And that makes round 5 the HomePow Mini on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right. And overall, I was surprised by the quality of the HomePow, given that it looks and feels like a toy. But while the picture quality was mostly fine, it wasn't anywhere near as good as the Umbelite, which easily won this round also. So in round 6, the ScreenMax C7 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right. And unlike the HomePow from the previous round, the ScreenMax actually feels pretty sturdy and well built. But even though the ScreenMax's overall brightness was almost identical to the Umbelite, the actual picture looked washed out and undersaturated in bright scenes, and muddy and gray in dark scenes, meaning the Umbelite moved on. In round 7, the Transurject T800 is on the left, and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right. And unlike the previous rounds where I thought the Umbelite was slightly undersaturated, the Transurject had so little color that it made the Umbelite look oversaturated in comparison. And in moderately lit scenes, the lower contrast on the Transurject made it look both undersaturated and washed out, so the Umbelite won this round too. Next, in round 8, the LSL HA04 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right. And in addition to an incorrect squashed aspect ratio, the LSL HA04 was also noticeably blurry compared to the Umbelite, and it's got less than half the overall brightness, and ultimately it didn't stand a chance and the Umbelite moved on again. In round 9, the CBest W13 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right, and the CBest is an absolute garbage tier projector that combines terrible brightness and contrast with even worse image processing and settings to make a basically unwatchable image, making this another quick win for the Umbelite. In round 10, the Sannyer Q100 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 is still on the right, and the Sannyer saw how terrible the performance of the CBest was, and it was not going to be outdone. And coming in at just 39 lumens for $39, this projector is an absolute joke, and it's definitely the worst performance that we've seen since the AntMap in round 1, so the Umbelite moved on again. And that means that round 11 is the Enusuma HY300 Pro on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right. And the short throw of both of these projectors makes them difficult to film at the same time since they both kind of get in the way, but this was a decently close round with the HY300 Pro having enough brightness to compete and very similar color and saturation to the HY320 Mini, but the focus on the 320 Mini was noticeably better, and even though the image was slightly over sharpened, the processing on the Umbelite made for a much more clear and detailed image, so it easily moved on again. So in round 12, another short throw projector, the FearWiki P2 is on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini is on the right, and overall the P2 was just fine. It had decent brightness, good color, and even okay focus, though it wasn't nearly as sharp as the HY320 Mini. And in bright scenes, they were not too far off, but in the darkest scenes, I thought the HY320 Mini was significantly better, earning it another win. Round 13 has the Niso Z1 on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right, and the Niso is the first projector so far to have more brightness than the HY320 Mini. And overall, I thought the picture quality was pretty good, if not a little bit too blue. But there were two main reasons that I didn't pick it to win this round. First, it had an absolutely atrocious out-of-the-box contrast ratio of 245:1, which I was able to slightly improve by lowering the brightness in its picture settings. But second, it was trying to sabotage the HY320 Mini by casting all kinds of stray light onto the left side of the Umbelite screen, which was much more distracting in person than you can see on video. But ultimately that means that the Umbelite moves on again. Round 14 is the Takaki X3 on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right, and like the last round, I thought that both of the projectors looked pretty good in bright scenes. And I was fully expecting this to be the HY320 Mini's last round because the Takaki had the highest measured contrast of all the projectors. But in actual content, the shadow details were just totally crushed. And while neither of these projectors are excellent in dark scenes, the HY320 Mini was definitely better, so it moved on again. Round 15 has the JY360 on the left and the Umbelite HY320 on the right. And the JY360's picture quality is just about as bad as its brand name, with oversaturated green colors and extremely crushed shadow details, so the Umbelite easily moved on again. So round 16 has the Hackdill HA03 on the left and the Umbelite HY320 Mini on the right. And I thought both of these projectors looked pretty good, with the Hackdill shifted towards a cooler white balance. But it did maintain similar contrast and focus to the Umbelite. And on paper, the Hackdill's contrast was higher, but in actual content, it really could have used a higher gamma setting because shadow details were slightly crushed compared to the Umbelite, and this round was close, but in the end, the Umbelite came out on top. In round 17, the third place finisher from last year, the Vanvo VF320 is on the left, and the Umbelite HY320 is on the right. And if you're wondering why last year's third place finisher is in this year's video, it's because the first and second place projectors are now over $100, so they don't qualify for this video. But putting the Vanvo side by side with the Umbelite that swept the previous 16 rounds just puts into perspective how unimpressive most of the other projectors in this video are. And basically everything about the Vanvo, including its brightness, sharpness, gamma, and contrast were all way better than the Umbelite, and so the Vanvo easily won this round. So in round 18, the Vanvo VF320 is on the left, up against the fourth place finisher from last year, the Haprun H1, which has been one of my overall recommendations for the last 3 years. And the Haprun is just a solid performer, with a slightly cooler color temperature, but good brightness and overall clarity. But just like last year, it was no match for the Vanvo VF320, which just has a more appropriate gamma curve for these lower brightness inexpensive projectors. And while the Haprun is a solid performer, the Vanvo easily won this round. Round 19 then has the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Zentility A10 Plus on the right. And the A10 Plus probably would have done fine in previous rounds, and it might have even stood a chance to the HY320 Mini, but compared compared to the Vanvo's lower gamma setting, there's just so much missing detail in the shadowy areas. And on much higher end projectors, a high gamma setting with darker midtones and shadows is seen as the correct way to set up a home theater projector, but under 200 lumens and in the environment where most people are going to be watching a sub $100 projector, the Vanvo's image processing just makes much more sense, so the Vanvo's going to move on. So in round 20, the Vanvo VF320 is on the left and the Wemius P61 is on the right. And this was a joke, and the Wemius looked truly terrible in just about every scene, so the Vanvo moved on again. Round 21 then has the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Saint-Lor AMX100 on the right, and while it certainly wasn't as bad as the Wemius, the AMX100 was extremely flat and washed out compared to the Vanvo in bright scenes, and in dark scenes it had dim highlights and low shadow detail, so the Vanvo moved on again. And that makes round 22 the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Fifui HY260 Pro on the right, and in the time that it took me to pronounce that name, you've probably already figured out that it didn't stand a chance against the Vanvo, which easily won this round too. Round 23 then put the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Vanvo VF211 on the right, and despite a $29 increase in price, the more expensive Vanvo VF210 had half the brightness, less contrast, and was missing the excellent image processing of the VF320, and is easily the worst value of any of the projectors in this video. So then in the final round, we've got the Vanvo VF320 on the left and the Fidoni GC888A on the right, and throughout all these side-by-sides, everything has been graded on a sliding scale relative to other sub $100 projectors. But the Fidoni actually looks pretty decent even relative to projectors that cost 2 and 3 times as much. And it doesn't have the 700 plus lumens of something like the LFS W1K, but for under $100, this is a really solid performance in both bright and dark scenes. And in the last round, the Fidoni GC888A is gonna steal away the first place spot from the Vanvo VF320 in picture quality rankings. And here's how I ranked the top 10, and the plan was then to do some additional testing just on the top 5. Unfortunately though, while I was writing the script, I realized that the Vanvo VF320 from last year's video that finished in second place is no longer available, and it's been replaced with an upgraded version that looks almost identical, but it's got a 1080p native display. So I bought that too. But unfortunately it performed terribly compared to the old 720p native version, and it not only lacked the sharp focus of the 720p version, but it also didn't have any of the same image processing and gamma improvements that helped the old VF320 finish second. And to add insult to injury, the new VF320 also lost the main feature that made me recommend it in 2024, which was its low input lag. And if you're not familiar, when you're playing video games, the input lag represents the time in between when you press a button on the controller and when you see that action on the screen. And in general, input lag numbers under 20 milliseconds are excellent for all gaming. Between 20 and 50 milliseconds is good for casual gaming. 50 to 100 milliseconds can feel a little bit strange, and input lag numbers over 100 milliseconds should not be used for gaming. And I tested all these projectors at 1080p 60 Hz using the industry standard Leobotter lag tester, and I found that the old Vanvo VF320 still had the best input lag at 26.6 milliseconds. The Hapron H1 hovered around 30 milliseconds. The Fidoni GC888A was just under that 50 millisecond mark for casual gaming. And as I mentioned before, the new Vanvo VF320, which I wouldn't recommend anyways based on its image quality, now has between 70 and 80 milliseconds of input lag. And then all the projectors with Android built in were well over 100 milliseconds, meaning they can't be used for gaming. Next, I evaluated their focus and clarity, and there are two main things that affect the overall clarity of the image. The first being the native resolution, and of the remaining top 5 projectors, they all claim to be 1080p native. But counting the pixels used on each letter in my focus pattern tells me that only the Hapron H1 and Fidoni GC888A are actually 1080p native, while the Hactil, Zentili, and Umbelite are all using 720p native resolution panels. And the second thing that affects image clarity is the quality of the lens, and I thought that the Hactil had the sharpest lens, and the A10 Plus was by far the worst. And combining their native resolution and their lens quality, the Fidoni ranked first overall in focus, followed by the Hactil, then the Hapron, then the HY320 Mini, and the Zentili was in a distant last place. Also worth noting in this section is that the Fidoni, Hactil, and Zentili all have motorized focus that is controllable on the remote, so it's easier to get up next to the screen and dial in the image perfectly, while the Hapron and the HY320 Mini both have manual focus dials only. The next big difference in these 5 projectors is their throw distance, and to project a 100-inch screen, the Hapron H1 needs the largest distance from the projector to the screen screen at 127 inches, which is a 1.46 to 1 throw ratio, while the HY320 Mini needs just 81 inches, which is a throw ratio of 0.93 to 1. And just because I measured them all, here are the throw distances of the rest of the projectors in this video as well. If you can't put your projector in the exact correct position to fit it on the screen, it's also useful to have a digital keystone function, and of these top 5 projectors, the only one that doesn't include digital keystone is the Hapron H1, and the Hackdill, Zenality, and Umbolite all have 4-point corner keystone, while the Fedoni has a slightly more difficult to use angular keystone function, and of these 5 projectors, the Hackdill, Zenality, and Umbolite all have built-in aiming stands, while the Fedoni and Hapron just have an adjustable front foot to tilt the projector up. And if you want to ceiling mount them, all the top 5 projectors except for the Hackdill have a 1/4-20 tripod mount on the bottom. Next, looking at their smart operating systems, the Umbolite HY320 Mini runs Android 11, and the Hackdill and Zenality have Android 13. But none of those are the kind of Android that's meant to be used on a TV or projector. And as a result, they have pretty poor compatibility with most apps, and clunky interfaces that require you to use the remote as a mouse to get even basic functionality. That said, I was able to get YouTube working on all 3 of them. Netflix worked on the Hackdill but not on the others, and Disney Plus technically worked on the Zenality, but it didn't play any sound. And in all cases, I think that you're probably better off just getting a cheap streamer like a Fire TV stick to use with these projectors. And while we're on the subject of sound, none of the speakers on these projectors are particularly good, but the Zenality was the loudest and the most balanced.
I hope you fix that surge.
The Fedoni was almost as loud, but it was focused more on the mid-range.
I hope you fix that surge.
The Hackdill was slightly quieter with a huge spike around 400 Hz, which is in the high mid-range above where most vocals take place.
I hope you fix that surge.
The Hapron was just under 70 decibels average, but had a fairly flat frequency response.
I hope you fix that surge.
And the Umbolite HY320 Mini was the quietest at 67.5 decibels with a large spike around 600 Hz.
I hope you fix that surge.
And last, fan noise is always a concern with these cheap projectors, so here they are from the quietest to the loudest.
This is what the room sounds like with no projectors on.
So it's conclusion time. Should you buy any of these projectors? Unfortunately, the answer to that is pretty complicated. If your budget is $100, the Fedoni is the clear winner. It's the brightest, it's got the best picture quality, acceptable input lag for casual gamings, it's got motorized focus, a 1080p native display, decent speakers, digital keystone, and HDMI CEC support for controlling your streaming stick with the Fedoni remote. And overall, the Fedoni was the only projector that didn't disappoint me in some way. However, I was fully ready to give my recommendation to the Umbolite HY320 Mini that finished 3rd in overall picture quality, has a nice small form factor, a mildly usable smart operating system, and puts out almost 200 lumens for just $26.49, which is almost unbelievably cheap. But as of writing the script, it is already unavailable just 10 days after I bought it. Now, the good news is that Umbolite is just a reseller, and the HY320 Mini is actually made by Magcubic, so it should have some other sellers, and I will try to keep the link in the description updated with one that's actually available, but I don't think that you should ever pay more than around $40 for it. Similarly, the Hapron H1 did well enough to earn my recommendation again in 2025, but I don't think it's worth the $76 that it's currently selling for, and I think it's more fairly priced in the $50 to $60 range. But as you can see in my price tracker, it's only been under $70 one time since July 2025, which is pretty disappointing. The Hackdill and Zenality both have Android 13, but the big difference is that the Zenality makes all of Android 13's picture options available. to let you adjust things like gamma and white balance, and it's also got better speakers and a fairly quiet fan. But it does have relatively poor focus, a 720p native display, and some pretty annoying bugs, like the fact that it doesn't play any sound through its speakers unless you go into the Fire TV settings and set the sound to PCM output instead of auto. But ultimately, I still think it's a decent value at around $70 to $80 if you want to try to mess around with its built-in Android operating system. As always, there are no sponsored reviews on this channel, but I do have links down in the description for all the projectors in this video, and as always, I appreciate when you use those links, since as an Amazon affiliate, I do earn a small commission on the sale at no cost to you. I'd also like to thank all of my awesome patrons over at Patreon for their continued support of my channel, and if you're interested in supporting my unsponsored reviews, please check out the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching The Hookup.